chit chat, and then we won't get into the real stuff until like 6. Right? Unheard of that we're actually a little bit ahead of it. That means something's going to go wrong. Because if we're a little bit ahead of it, that's not proper. There's something wrong in the world. Are we up?
Yep.
All right. Is it 6 o'clock on your thing yet, or still 5:59?
It's still 5:59.
Mine says 5:59 still, so we'll wait for 6 before we say hello. We have some people in the chat. Oh, people are eagerly awaiting the finished quilt. Spoiler alert, it's not quite finished. But anyway, we got a little bit early. Oh, there it is, 6 o'clock, so now we can get started. All right. Welcome to another evening of sewing with Brent and his sidekick Eddie. We are going to finish up the New England Shop Hop quilt today. I did get a few frantic emails and messages when I posted that short video of the Vermont row the other day. They're like, "Oh my gosh, you did the row! How did you do it?" I'm not going to get into it too much. I did save the last row for the quilt to put on, so I can kind of go over again how we size things to get it to go. If you've watched the previous episodes, wait, I'm going right into this. Do we have shop news? Or are we good?
Danny said something.
The big shop hop starts on Friday. The New England Shop Hop starts Friday. So we've got some deals going on. I forgot to post them. There's like Kimberbell's like 10% off or 20% off. We got some good deals. So if you're coming to the Shop Hop, make sure you get the flyer that has all the specials on it. That's all I'm going to say. And that's going to go through the length of the Shop Hop, which is all through September and October. Yes, 2 months. But that starts Friday, runs through the month. So that's the only news we've got. So we should probably get into this because I'm hoping to get the borders on today. So like I said, I did put a short up of the Vermont row, and I did get a couple messages of people concerned that I didn't go over how to make the row. I made the row like I make all the rows, and I've got the last row we're going to throw on, and we'll go over that a little bit. But there wasn't really anything different. The only thing that I was doing when we're making our rows, well, I guess I should show you the quilt that we've got so far. Get everybody excited, right? So I've got 4 rows done. So that's the quilt so far. Is that all in the frame? Is that good enough?
Yeah.
You can kind of see it?
Yeah, you can't really see the bottom.
Okay, well here, how's that? There. Can I see the bottom now?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's what we've got so far. So we really haven't changed, like I said, the row construction is pretty much the only thing that I'm really worried about when we're putting rows together is I want to make sure that our bear tracks go across the quilt. That's the only thing that we're worried about lining up when we're putting rows. So when I'm laying my rows out, for example, we might have to do an overhead shot for this. One of the things that happened on the Vermont row is you'll notice, oh, you're going overhead, right?
Yep.
All right. What happened on the Vermont is I had to put Vermont on this side of the bear tracks versus the other side that we had New Hampshire on, because we wanted to make sure the bear tracks lined up properly. So that's the only thing that I've been keeping track of when I was putting these rows on, was to make sure that we can follow, and if you're looking closely, you're going to see that my points aren't perfect, but I don't care because that's the type of person I am. If you do care, then you're going to want to be pay a little bit more attention. The only thing I'm lining up between rows is my bear tracks. Everything else, I'm just throwing a row together, and that's my reference point as I'm piecing the row. Like, where do I put my different parts of the block? It's all just in relation to where I have to get these bear paws lined up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep, nobody's complaining?
I don't think so.
Yes, John, your tree looks great. And what you'll notice, too, is I felt that, we put another mini tree over here. That was another thing that we did. We remember when we used the tree the first time, we had an 18.5-inch block that we needed to do. All I did is I took 2 strips out of the tree to make a 12.5 to go on my Massachusetts row. So that tree got in there too. And then you'll see that we put the leaf blocks up here. So there's our leaf block. Now, I did save the last row so I can show you just kind of how I was piecing this. Are we still overhead?
Yep.
Okay. Let's show people the last row. Now, one of the things I ran into as I'm putting this together, because remember, I'm making this up as I go, so some of this stuff kind of gets made up on the fly. I decided to put Connecticut and Rhode Island together in the last row, and it kind of makes sense on a map too. But if you're from Connecticut or Rhode Island and you want to have your own row, then you could put like Vermont and New Hampshire on the same row, and then you could divide up Connecticut and Rhode Island. But I couldn't do a sixth row because what would happen is, notice how close to the end these bear paws are. I would have ran out of space and had to come back, so I just decided to, for two reasons. First off, I was running out of space with the bear paws, and secondly, I was getting lazy and didn't want to do a sixth row. But it's going to come out all right. So now if we go back to the overhead, I have made this row longer than it needs to be. That I know for sure. I keep it from sliding. I'll put that over there. It will, okay. So all I'm going to do now to sew this row on is I did a little bit of math. You know, you guys all saw how I did my math last week, where I would just cut it about where I thought I should and then sew it together. I did the same thing. I didn't create squares here. I actually made the strips. That's the whole. Is this part in the screen? Can you see that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. All I'm going to do now is I've got the row made, and all I'm going to do is line this up and sew it together. And I made the row longer than it needs to be, because one of the things I've done is a strip set at the end. See how much extra I have here? I think the edge of the quilt's going to come to about here, and we'll just trim that off when we're done. But I've got a little room for error on this side, and I've got a little room for error on this side. When I was doing my math, I think I gave myself a couple inches or an inch on each side, so this is going to be a little bit longer than it needs to be as well. So as long as I've got this lined up, nothing else has to be exact, because I've given myself a little bit extra to trim off. So when I sew this together with this lined up, I'll just trim the edges after, and our rows are done. Make sense?
Yeah.
That was how all these rows went together. This was the only point that I really cared about lining up, because there's kind of that scrappy look, and you'll notice some spots stuff seems to line up better than others, but at the end of the day, this is the only thing I'm really worried about, because that was kind of the structure I was adding to the quilt was through the bear. Oh my gosh, that didn't work out well.
That was in a ruckus.
That was a ruckus. Speaking of ruckus,
I don't know.
you know what I want? Have you ever seen a Honda Big Ruckus scooter?
No.
That's like on my list of like scooters I need to own. But they only made them for like 2 years, so they're hard to find. Oh, it did break. Dang it. I was hoping that it didn't break and I wouldn't have to rethread it. All that ruckus. So I thought we were going to have an episode where you didn't get to watch me thread a machine, but apparently,
It's tradition.
well, it's like fate conspired against me. It's like, you know what? You're all set, so. Yeah, but ruckus. Look at a Honda Big Ruckus. Like, they made them for like only 2 years. But what's cool about them is like the standard Honda Ruckus only has a 50cc engine in it. Guess what a Big Ruckus has for an engine, Eddie?
Yeah, I looked it up. It's 250.
250cc. That's the same size engine that's in my Honda Helix. In fact, I think it's almost the same engine. That would be an awesome scooter to own. Do you see how cool it looks too? It's got like that Mad Max look to it because it's just like there's no plastic on it. Anyway,
Hummingbird fabric.
what's that?
Hummingbird fabric. John is asking if we have a hummingbird.
I don't think so. We had some earlier this year, but I think we sold it out. It's been sold out. There's like a hummingbird and dragonfly collection, and the hummingbirds went. That purple. Remember that purple collection? Had hummingbirds with it, I thought.
I don't think we have any right now.
No, I don't think so either. Wow, this is painful today, Eddie. Normally it just goes right in. And I wish Danny was here to give us a that's what she said remark on that, but she wasn't. So okay. So we got that all taken care of. So all I'm gonna do now is to sew this together. If I was okay. Is I'm just going to line these up. I did make sure they're pressed in the opposite direction so the seams lock in. And I'm going to start on this end because that's the short end. And as long as those are lined up, I'm just going to zip a seam down that. Now, some of you that are perfectionists, you saw how my points weren't perfect earlier. That's because I don't use pins, and I should, but I'm not going to. So if I was a perfectionist, I would pin this row on there, but that's. Any of you that have been watching for any length of time know that would be may cause me problems to pin because It's a medical condition I have that I've, have an allergy to pins. So there we go. And let me just get that going, and away we go. Now there's a couple other design considerations that came up when we were putting this together. One of the problems that we ran into, that because of the only doing 5 rows instead of 6, made a problem in that our quilt almost is a little bit wider than it is longer. And that is something that I don't like in a quilt. I don't know why that bothers me, but I don't like having a quilt that's wider than it is longer. So the other thing that we have to do, as I'll show you, is we added a kind of a spacer strip top and bottom of another fabric that we didn't use a lot of in the quilt, so it kind of adds to it. Oh, there's a couple other things I wanted to show you that we did too. But let me get this on so you can all see what it's going to look like, because I know that's what you all came here for, was to see the finished quilt. And like I said, I even cut the borders ahead of time because I'm like, we're going to get this done. Anybody complaining yet about how awful we're doing?
I don't think so.
Okay.
We wait for the last, make it in the last row.
Well, the other thing it saved me from having to do is every row had a stake, a block, and the bear paw. But I didn't want to, like I said, I got lazy. And I would have had to make either another tree or another leaf block. And like I said, I'd have to figure out what I was going to do with the bear paws, because the bear paws were going to go off the end of the quilt, and that wasn't going to work. So it just made sense to put Rhode Island and Connecticut together, so then we don't have to worry about coming up with another block. And it looks right, because like I said, if you look at it on a map, it makes sense. At least that's my theory. And if you're from Connecticut or Rhode Island, there's no disrespect that I didn't give you your own row. And if you're watching this and you're making your own, like I said, this is very kind of open to personal interpretation. So if you were from Rhode Island or Connecticut and wanted your own row, you could easily combine like Vermont and New Hampshire, because they would make sense on the same row as well. But because I'm from New Hampshire, and that also happened to be the first row that we did, so that's kind of why it got its own row, because we were making this up as we went along. It just worked out that way. All right. So what I'm going to show you before I even show this off, I want to go to overhead shot. So you can see here. You see how much extra I have of this strip? I did that on purpose so that I didn't have to pay a whole lot of attention to where the only thing I was worried about lining up is where my bear paws came together. So I gave myself extra space. This was actually the leftovers from the strip. I just sewed it on and said I'm going to cut off what's left from that strip set. And then on this side here, when I was figuring out where to do my bear paw, I gave myself kind of an extra inch or two here. So that was part of my math, so I didn't have to think too hard about my math. I knew that it was going to be over enough that I'll have something to trim off. So I'm just going to trim that off, because all we were worried about, like I said, is lining this up. Although that point came out really good too. I didn't even pin it. But what you'll notice is the only thing that really lines up is going to be like your bear paw here lines up, but like over here, the edge of this is it's very scrappy. This doesn't line up, that doesn't line up, but I don't care. The only thing that we really cared about. The other thing I also wanted to show you before I show off the quilt is one of the other things. Remember how when we were trimming up the panel, I said save the stuff around the edges? Well, it turns out that Massachusetts wasn't 12.5 inches tall. So I had to add a couple inches to it. So I took what was left from the words that are around the panel, sewed that to the bottom. Had to do the same thing over here with Connecticut. Added it to the bottom, and I also ended up doing that with Vermont. Now, Vermont, if I had paid attention when we were cutting the panels, I probably could have gotten at 12.5. So if you're watching this in the future, before you start cutting, when you cut up your panel, 12.5 high is what you're shooting for. But when you come up short, all I did is I just took the wording that was around the edge of the panel and used that to bring it out to 12.5. So far, so good? That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, here's what we've got so far. Like I said, we're almost there. So here it is. But what the problem we have now is that this quilt is a lot wider. I'm going to go all the way to the bottom so you can see what the bottom looks like. Can they see the last row, Eddie?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that good?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Problem we have though is that this quilt is now wider than it is longer by about, when we did, what did we do our math? It was like 6 inches? Something like that. So what I decided we're gonna do to fix that problem is I'm just gonna add a strip of this leaf print top and bottom. I already did it to the top because the top was done. And there's not a lot of that red in the quilt either, so I just thought we would throw that in there, top and bottom, to make it, to take the dimension, to keep it, to give me a rectangle. There's that whole thing with the golden ratio of, I can't remember what it is, but a certain ratio of the width times the length, that's like the perfect ratio. There's like a whole mathematical thing. I don't know what it is. 60 by 80 is what I usually shoot for. That's kind of in the ballpark. This is almost square at this point. By adding that top and bottom strip, it's going to make it a little bit more rectangular. Personal preference. This strip is at 4.5 inches. After I cut the strips and started sewing on, I realized I should have done them at 3.5 inches, because if I did a 3.5 inch strip, that would be the same width strip that we use to make the block, and so you only have to cut 3.5 inch strips. I suppose you could use 4.5, and then the scraps you can cut down to 3.5 to make some of your leaf blocks. But again, I didn't think of all of that. This is, like I said, we've been making it up as we go along. So let's get that last. We'll sew that strip on the bottom and finish our quilt top, and then we'll add our borders. And if you look behind me here, we're going to be using this black as the border. And with a little luck, we'll get them all on today. I don't know that we're going to get that far. Let me start here, because I always think borders go on quick, and it turns out taking you like 4 hours to get the borders on. I don't know why that is, and I'm not going to keep you all here for 4 hours. Okay. Any questions at this point about our quilt? Like I said, I'm going to see if I can't get this edited down to something a little bit more manageable if you actually want to use this video to make your own version of this quilt. It's like there's no real, I will figure out the fabric requirements. I don't think you're using much more than a yard and a half of each fabric. Even though it's a big quilt, we use so many different fabrics, you don't need a lot of yardage of any one of them. And like I said, this was a creative process. This is how this is a lot of times how I'll make my quilts. I start out, just kind of start out with, and just see where the process takes me. There's a lot of interpretation. Like I said, you could switch Vermont, New Hampshire on the same row instead of Connecticut and Rhode Island. You could still give each state its own row and just do one last row without a bear paw to go across the middle. You could scrap the whole bear paw idea altogether and just have a bunch of rows, which is fine too. I just like the idea of the tracks adding a little bit of a cohesiveness to the pattern. The other thing you could also do that I thought about doing was you could zigzag instead of going straight across with the bear paw with the bear tracks. You could zigzag it, which would have also been kind of fun. There's a bunch of different things you could do while making this because it's what's fun about it is just kind of wherever the process takes you. And that was the idea behind this series of videos, was to show you the process by which I make a quilt. And I'm not saying it's the right process or the only process, but for a quilt like this where I'm just kind of making it up as I go, this is the process I use. I don't spend a lot of time cutting or with graph paper trying to figure it all out exactly. I tend to just throw it together, and it's going to show, and it shows in my quilts, because like I said, the only thing that really lines up on this thing is the bear paw, because that's all I cared about. Some quilts I'll spend a little bit more time trying to make stuff line up and spend more time with the math of it, but for this one, I just didn't see the need. Like I said, it was more of a kind of a fun, we have a panel, what can we do with it? And you all saw, if you started in the beginning, you saw how the panel started, and you see where we're at. And you got to see pretty much the whole thing. Like I said, there's a few things we did off camera, finishing up a few rows, but the process really didn't change at all. All right. So far, so good, right?
Yep.
Let me just iron this out. I mean, I could, I suppose, add the borders without ironing, but I don't like to do that, believe it or not. Even I have some standards. And the other thing I did do, like I said, I love my easy angle. you'll notice, can you see here? I do have my strips here connected at a 45. I like the way that looks, especially with a print like this, because you really can't see where the seam is at. Whereas if you had a straight seam, it would jump out at you a little bit more. By doing a 45, it kind of hides it a little bit. But that's, like I said, I think we've gone over that before, but that's just one of those things that, I guess I should have ironed where the row comes together too. Who cares? So at this point, the dimensions of this are roughly 72 by 74. 72 wide by 75, 72 wide by 74 high, long. Like I said, it's almost square. I don't really care. It's a good size. One of the things we also, another consideration, because then the question becomes, how wide do you make your borders? And how wide do you make your borders, Eddie? So we know that this is 72 wide. I'm just going to have this quick conversation. Well, I'll start attaching the borders and talk about this while we're doing it. And this is not a directional print, so we're just going to throw them on the side. One of the things that you have to consider when you're throwing a quilt together is how wide it is, because that was the question that we were trying to decide. How wide are we going to make this outer border? And so we know the quilt itself is 72 inches. What's the magic number, Eddie, for the width of a quilt?
80?
88.
88?
80, I like to keep it around 80 personally. Why? Why is it good to keep it around 80?
That's 6 feet. No. That's bad math.
Yeah, that's bad math.
That's 6.5 feet.
Yes, but why 80?
How wide is regular width fabric?
42, 44, 42?
42, 44, right? So I always tell people, count on having 40 inches usable. So what's 40 times 2? 80. If you've got to piece the back of your quilt, you don't want to go over 80 inches, because otherwise it's not going to be just a straight seam down the middle. That's one of my considerations. That's why. But with extra wide backs, they're 108 wide. So if you keep it under 100, then you don't have to piece it back. You can just use a extra wide backing and use a single piece. But I usually try to keep it, like I said, if I think I'm going to be piecing the backing, I try to keep it under 80 so that I can piece with one bit. The reason that I decided we went with 6.5, right? 6.5 finished out to 6. So this is going to be about a little over 80 wide, but I wasn't planning on piecing a back for it. If I was planning on piecing a back, I would have tried to keep it closer to 78 than 80. I mean, 80 is probably fine, but it's going to be really tight with a pieced back. My concern was that I was thinking I might put minky on this, and the minky comes in 88 wide. So that means if I keep this at 80, I still have the option of using minky without piecing. I hope that made sense to people that are watching. But that's one of the considerations, again, when you're just throwing stuff together, those are things to consider. Because you can piece as much as you want. You can have this thing could be 120 wide for all I care, if that's what you want to do. But that's a consideration is, all right, 120 wide, what are you doing for a back? And that's all that that was one of the considerations that when we were talking about how big the border to put on, was based on how wide. Because a lot of times for length, if you're using extra wide, you just cut more. It's the width that you have to worry about. That's going to be the thing that kind of makes piecing or whatnot a little bit more of a pain, is more of a measurement you have to pay attention to. Is there any questions on our chat about any of this? Why does this suddenly hate me, Eddie? It's going along so good. I'm like 6 inches from the end. And you know why? It's like, we want to see you thread the machine again. How did it jump out of the needle? That's bizarre. Like it just decided it didn't want to be in the needle. Oh well. So y'all get to watch this. Okay. So yeah, so that is why we're keeping it, like I said, we're putting it, and the other reason that I decided on 6.5 inch borders is what was the, what's the row width? all of our rows were multiples of 6, right?
Yeah.
It was either a 12-inch row or an 18-inch row, and they were comprised of, well, 12 and a half or 16 and a half, and they were 18 and a half, and they were comprised of 6.5-inch rows. So the width that we're using of 6.5 is already in the quilt. So there's kind of all right. Do you want to keep going? Should we throw another border on, or y'all want to see what it looks like with the one border on?
I mean, I think they know.
They get an
how
idea.
to put on a border.
Yeah, but see, that's what it's going to look like. I had thought about putting an inner border on, but I decided against it. I think the black just kind of sets everything off real nice. And then we're going to go across the top as well. But that's kind of what it's going to look like. If you want to see the finished product, we should, with a little bit of luck, we'll have it hanging in the store by Saturday. You think Saturday's?
That seems doable.
It seems doable. Saturday afternoon, maybe. Yeah, because I still got to finish the borders up. But if you want to see it done, we'll show it off next week so you can see what it looks like next week. But also, like I said, we'll be able to see it in person. I will hopefully have the. We'll also work up fabric requirements for this, so that if it's something that you want to make your own version of it, because like I said, this is going to be. I'm hoping that this is enough of a tutorial for anybody that wants to copy this quilt, that you can watch the process that we went through and kind of make your own version of it. And I'll be honest, if you're one of those people that wants a perfect quilt, this process is not perfect. If you look closely at some of my rows, the points don't line up and all that. And you could take your time and make them line up. The big thing for myself personally is I'm not that concerned about it. I think it's close enough. It's got a real nice kind of a scrappy look to it. So once it's finished up and hanging on the wall, even if I do have a quilter that comes in, because I know some of you watchers are going to come in and see those points aren't right, it's all right with me, because when I'm done with this quilt, after the shop hop's over and everybody's bought their fabric and we've sold all the fabric, I'm going to take this home and throw it on the couch, and I'm not going to care that the points aren't perfect, because it's going to get used. It's going to be a fun quilt. It's got a really nice it's got a really nice New England scrap feel to it. So. Like I said, I'll work up keep an eye out. We'll probably follow this up next week with kind of the final dimensions and everything if you want. We'll also try and edit this and put comments and all that. But we'll work up a sheet of what you're going to need for material to make this. As it looks right now, I'm thinking you're just going to need a panel, 1.5 yards of the border print, and I'm thinking about 1.5 yards of everything else, and you're good to go. Some of it maybe not quite so much, but we'll work out. I'll figure that out for everybody. Anyway, any questions before we call it a day?
I don't think there's any questions.
All right. I'm kind of excited about it. This came out really nice. I think it really kind of, I really think it's nice. I'll admit one of the things, when we're talking about this quilt, go to an overhead. I don't know if this shows through because of the color problems with the overhead. This red and this red are two different reds.
It looks different on the screen.
Yeah, on the screen it's gonna, but it's not that bad. I'm not too worried about it. But one of the things, if you are making this a little bit different than what we have done, I wouldn't want this right next to that anywhere in the quilt, because it's when you put them right next to each other, you can see that there's more orange in this one than this one. And it's not a problem. I think it looks fine in the quilt because it's scrappy enough, but that is something to consider, that the couple of fabrics are kind of like, those don't really go together, but it works. We had fun. Any other questions?
Tonight's a blue moon.
Ooh, tonight's a blue moon. Isn't there a movie like about Smurfs in the blue moon? Do you remember? As a kid, you and your sibling dragged me to that movie, and I remember falling asleep in it.
I don't remember.
In the Smurf movie, it was.
I remember watching.
It was borderline awful, and it had something to do with the blue moon, and the Smurfs came out and somehow got transported. It was just anyway.
It's a good song though.
What, blue moon?
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, I guess I should take us out at this point. If you haven't, like I said, stop in probably by next week for sure. We'll have it done. Hopefully by the weekend we'll have this finished up, and we'll get quantities figured out for it too, so people can get an idea what it needs. And when we start figuring that out, the other thing to keep in mind too is you can use any fabric for this. You don't necessarily need to use the shop hop fabric. This is just what we had, but stuff like this is easy to do. The panel is kind of where we started, but you can use the same process for lots of different ways. But anyway, thanks for watching. So on, and be excellent to each other.